This class is titled The History of the Burlington Rabbis and the Responsa of the Burlington Rabbis. Just want to give a brief introduction how I got to this topic. Every Thursday evening, usually have a class called, it's based on Responsa. Responsa is a genre of rabbinic texts that deal with questions that arrive, modern questions that arrive, and when someone and different individuals asked rabbis, is this permitted according to the Torah? What's the Torah's view on this or on that? And the rabbis usually wrote a letter answering back, and they usually saved a copy of the letter in their archives, and eventually they printed these questions and these answers. These go back, Rashi, the Rambam, Maimonides, we're talking about the 9th, 10th, 11th century, have this, and you could even go back to the times of the Gaonim, the times of the Gaonic period as well. You have these type of things. So I was trying to see any interesting questions, and I came to a interesting book called The Question and Answers of Yehoshua. Who is Yehoshua? Yehoshua is Yehoshua Klavin. Yehoshua Klavin was the rabbi of Ohavei Tzedek from the year 1925 to roughly 1936. And as I was looking at the questions and answers, lots of history came up within those questions and answers that are pertaining to Burlington in particular, even though he was a rabbi in quite a few places, but the individual interesting questions arrived that he discussed had to do specifically with Burlington, and specifically two interesting questions. One question was regarding the burial practices of the Jews in Burlington. As we'll soon see, as we'll get to probably not today, a different class, the burial practices of Burlington were the same practices as if they were in Russia and Poland. They were the very traditional way of burying someone, the way they do it in Israel today, that they put someone in a talus, they don't have a coffin, etc. In the 1930s, that began to change. The Jewish people in Burlington began to feel uncomfortable about burying someone without a coffin. And they came to ask him, is it okay to change the burial practices? And he gives a moral judgment on the people asking the question in a positive way, and he goes on to say his answer. Similarly also, the first divorce document that was issued by a rabbi in Burlington was in 1930, I think it was in 1930. Rabbi Klavin also was, someone came and I guess they wanted to get divorced, and he writes to a previous rabbi, as we'll soon see, of Burlington, how do you spell Burlington? That was one of his main questions. How do you spell Burlington? Because we know in a divorce document, it's a very hard document to write. Everything needs to be particularly exact. The name has to be exact, and there's hundreds of books on how to spell Jewish names, because you have to get the name correctly. The Torah says you have to write it with the name of the husband and the name of the wife, and also the place that they're getting divorced. And therefore, there was a big question about how to write the name Burlington. Was it in Hebrew? We'll discuss this probably next class when we get to the later rabbis. But is it spelled Beis Aleph Resh, Burlington, or Burlington, or Beis Vav Resh? That was one of the big questions that they had. And it's interesting, within that context, he actually refers to a different rabbi, though some might be familiar between Rabbi Sachs. Rabbi Sachs was a shoichet for the Jewish community, was a shochet for the Jewish community here in Burlington, and eventually in 1922 became the rabbi of Ohavei Tzedek, which, as we'll soon see, created a big splash in Burlington and divided the community, as we'll soon see. But I first wanted to start with a bit of an overview of the rabbis of Burlington, of the European rabbis of Burlington, the ones that grew up in Europe and the ones that lived in Burlington before 1945. A lot was written about the Jewish life in Burlington. There's even a film of Little Jerusalem and lots of interesting anecdotes of the life in Burlington. One thing that I felt was always missing was who were the rabbis in Burlington. And that was quite hard to gain a grasp what they were like, who were they, what they did, what they contributed to Burlington. There's no real records about the rabbis in Burlington. Even in the Pinchas is a ledger that the Jewish community kept. The Pinchas is a very interesting topic on its own. Almost every community had a Pinchas. They used to write down whatever happened in the community, and plenty of them are printed from hundreds and 200, 300, 400 years ago, and you gain great insight into how Jewish life was. So I had the privilege of actually seeing the Pinchas by Aaron Goldberg. Took me, and I saw the actual Pinchas, but there's pretty much very little mentioned about the rabbis in Burlington. I found one mention of that the Jews of Burlington finished the Mishnayos for the 11th time, and Rabbi Klavan gave a speech. But they don't write what he said, and it doesn't seem like they kept any files on the rabbis. Maybe the rabbis seemingly had their own files that they kept. And pretty much, it's pretty quiet about what their life was. There's a book by, I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce the first name, but Samuelson. I think it's, maybe Aaron could help me. Milan. And in there he writes a little bit about the rabbis of Burlington, but it's only very few stories. And what's missing is really their life and who were they like, where did they study, what caliber rabbi were they, who did they come in contact with, what questions did they deal with in Burlington, and what was their view upon the community, and more importantly, why each of them left eventually. You find in Rabbi Klavan's writings a urgency to leave Burlington. In every letter he writes, please find me another place to be a rabbi. It's interesting, we're soon going to discuss why the first rabbi of Burlington left, and that is, and it's an interesting reason on its own. I dug up this reason in a eulogy that someone gave when he passed away. Burlington had very great rabbis, actually, starting from Rabbi Rosenberg, as we'll see, the first Burlington rabbi, to Rabbi Goodman, Rabbi Pupkin, we'll see, and Rabbi Meskin, and Rabbi Klavan, and so on. They were very esteemed rabbis, very knowledgeable in Torah. And when you sift through their writings, you see how they wrote in Torah to the greatest Torah scholars that existed in those days. For example, Rabbi Klavan, which was the rabbi in Ovei Tzedek in the 20s and 30s, he regularly writes with his teacher, Reb Baruch Ber. Reb Baruch Ber is a very, very famous Talmudic scholar. He was the famous student of Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik. Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik was one of the most known Talmudic Torah scholars in the last 200 years. He created a method of Talmudic thought. His book Chidushei Reb Chaim is every individual that learned in yeshiva has a copy of his book. It's a staple in everyone's house. And his prize student was Reb Baruch Ber, and Rabbi Klavan was a student of Reb Baruch Ber. Rabbi Klavan regularly wrote to his teacher. So the rabbis in Burlington they hired great rabbis, and they spoke and they communicated in Torah with their teachers back in Europe, and discussed very interesting questions with them. An example of an interesting question, an example of such a thing, was Rabbi Meskin writes in his book that he had the esteemed honor to have Rabbi Shimon Shkup. Rabbi Shimon Shkup was another student of Reb Chaim Soloveitchik. Reb Shimon Shkup wrote a very deep Talmudic book called Shari Yosher. He's known for his brilliance in Talmudic thought, and he spent a Shabbos in Burlington on his way to see his daughter in Montreal. And Rabbi Meskin writes in one of his writings that when Rabbi Shimon Shkup was here, I showed him this response and he praised it. We see that the rabbis discuss Torah with the greatest of Torah scholars. We see that the level of their scholarship was great. We're going to discuss today the first Rabbi Rosenberg. I do want to give a thank you to Aaron Goldberg for sharing with me all that he knows about Burlington, and especially lending the book from Myron Samuelson, which helped me tremendously in this research. This is Rabbi Israel Rosenberg. He was a rabbi of Burlington from 1909 to 1911. What's interesting to note about the rabbis in Burlington, I would split them into two times. Rabbi Rosenberg wasn't just the rabbi of a synagogue; he was the rabbi of Burlington, meaning all synagogues got together. All synagogues got together to hire a rabbi, and we'll soon see how the rabbi was paid. It wasn't paid from the synagogue; it was paid of a tax on every Jewish person in Burlington, as we'll soon see. But the first rabbi was in 1909 to 1911, which is interesting to note. Ohavei Tzedek started in 1888, according to most sources, in 1888. Burlington did not have a rabbi until 20 years later, 1909. There was no rabbi. There was a shochet. Rabbi Sachs was a shochet. He slaughtered. He officiated in the religious life that needed to be done, but there was no official rabbi in Burlington for roughly 20 years. But Rabbi Rosenberg was the first rabbi to enter Burlington. After Rabbi Rosenberg, I'm just going to go through some of the rabbis, and then we're going to go on a deep dive in Rabbi Rosenberg's life itself. The next rabbi was Rabbi Yaakov Goodman. Rabbi Yaakov Goodman was a rabbi in Burlington for, I think, 6 months. Unfortunately, he passed away towards the end of prayer. He had his talis on, and he collapsed in the synagogue. If I remember correctly, who was that? George Solomon could point to the exact place where Rabbi Yaakov Goodman collapsed in the synagogue, and he was buried in Patchen Road. His grave stands until today. In his grave is inscribed, in middle of raising prayer to God, he collapsed and died. I think his gravestone should be restored a little bit. It's a little bit hard to read. But he was a rabbi here for only 6 months, and his passing had a very big effect on Burlington. After that was Rabbi Tzvi Chaim Popkin. He was a rabbi from 1912 to 1917. And eventually he left. Now those were three rabbis these three rabbis, Rabbi Rosenberg, Rabbi Goodman, and Rabbi Popkin, they were rabbis of all of Burlington. What happened after is that Ohavei Tzedek hired Rabbi Sachs to be rabbi. Rabbi Sachs was the shochet and the chazan, and he, for almost 20 years since then, but Ohavei Tzedek hired Rabbi Sachs to become their rabbi, and it was without consultation of the other two synagogues. Ohavei Tzedek started in 1888. If I'm not mistaken, in around 1898 or something around then, another synagogue was founded called Chaye Adam. Chaye Adam was the second synagogue in Burlington. Chaye Adam is, the word Chaye Adam means the life of man. But Chaye Adam is also a very important work that was authored by a rabbi in Lithuania called Rabbi Avram Danzig. He was the author of a book, Chaye Adam. I have them in my house. It's a book on Jewish law. He was related to the Vilna Gaon, to the Gra. And seemingly a lot of the immigrants that came to Burlington had roots next to Vilna, and the Chaye Adam, the Rabbi Avram Danzig, his book was a very famous work, and they used to learn his book to know Jewish law. So seemingly they called the synagogue Chaye Adam after that book, because there were a lot of groups that were called Chevras Chaye Adam or Chaburas Chaye Adam, meaning the group of Chaye Adam, meaning the group of people that got together to learn the book of Chaye Adam, which is a book on Jewish law. So that was in, I think, I'm not 100% sure of the date, but I think in the late 1800s. In 1906, there's actually a debate on why a new synagogue was needed in Burlington. One reason is because the owner, the one that started the Chaye Adam, had a store that was open on the Sabbath, on Shabbos. And even though he didn't work on Shabbos, but his store was open on Shabbos, which got him into a little trouble and made him uncomfortable. And therefore, they started he started a new synagogue. Another theory is that that he got upset about the religious level of Ohavei Tzedek back in the 1800s, and therefore he decided to open up his new synagogue. Maybe both reasons are true, as they usually are. But in 1906, a new synagogue was opened, Avas Gedim. Seemingly, as far as I understand the story is, they did not feel comfortable joining the synagogue, the other two synagogues where those immigrants arrived much earlier to Burlington, and therefore they opened up a new synagogue, Avas Gedim. Avas Gedim is the love of the stranger, and maybe their name says why they opened it up, because they wanted to feel, they did not feel the love of the previous immigrants. But those were the three synagogues in Burlington. What's interesting to note is that for a certain time, some Chaye Adam and Ohavei Tzedek had two separate Chevra Kadishas, two separate burial places even. But after a while, they made peace, and in the Pinkas of the community, you could find this big celebration that they're all coming back together to have one burial place and one group together. And they had they all had one rabbi. I'm not 100% sure how it worked, where the rabbi gave the speech. Did the rabbi ever go to the other synagogues? Did they split every week? You know, the Talmud asks, Shabbos shel mi. The famous question of the Talmud, there was a rabbi in a city, and there was two places for them. There were two rabbis in one city, and the question was, which rabbi is going to give the drasha, is going to give the speech in the synagogue? Shabbos shel mi. So I always wondered how exactly it worked. If there was one rabbi, did he only speak in Ohavei Tzedek, or he also went to the other synagogues as well? Ohavei Tzedek was the biggest synagogue. But after a while, after Rabbi Chaim Tzvi Popkin left, the Ohavei Tzedek hired Rabbi Sachs to become the rabbi, which was a very controversial move. On one hand, they did not ask the other synagogues for their consent, and also because Rabbi Sachs was the shochet, and he did a lot of business, and he was not on the pulpit for many years, they felt that his knowledge was a little rusty, and therefore did not really take too kindly to his position. And therefore, they again, they split, and they hired Rabbi Yechiel Hillel Gerelik. So Chaye Adam hired the new rabbi. So in 1922, there were two rabbis in Burlington. Rabbi Sachs was the rabbi of Ovei Tzedek. Rabbi Yechiel Hillel Gerelik was the rabbi of Chaye Adam. Rabbi Yechiel Hillel Gerelik passed away pretty shortly after he came, and his son took over for a year. Rabbi Yehuda Leib Gerelik took over for Chaye Adam. After Rabbi Sachs, I'm not sure why he left the pulpit, but Rabbi Klavin took over Rabbi Sachs from 1925 to 1936. Rabbi Klavin was a great, great Torah scholar. He has a book called Responsa of Dvar Yeshua, after his name, Rabbi Yeshua Klavin. As I said before, he was a student of the Baruch Ber, which is one of the great Talmudists in the last century. And and he was the rabbi for roughly 11 years. By the end of his tenure, you see in his writings, he's asking another rabbi, Rabbi Silver, in New York, if there's any openings. And Rabbi Silver answers back, there's too many rabbis. They all want a pulpit in New York, in the big city, and there's not enough work. Eventually, he became a rabbi in Washington, and he worked very hard to give money to the Jewish people in Europe. By the Second World War, he was part of the Vada Tzola, a group of people that worked very hard to collect money and to save a lot of Jewish people. So that's Rabbi Klavin was the rabbi in Ovei Tzedek. Rabbi Meskin was the rabbi in Chaye Adam. Roughly around the same time, a year earlier, he left a year earlier, roughly around the same time, Rabbi Meskin was the rabbi. Rabbi Meskin was a prolific writer. He wrote many, many books on the Talmud. He published many of his responsas. An interesting responsa that he published was before he moved to America, we know the Titanic sank, and there was a woman that her husband was on the Titanic and did not know if the husband perished or not. There was no sign of her husband in her. Her husband was not saved on any of the lifeboats, but she did not know if halachically we could consider that her husband for sure passed away, and therefore if she could get married again. Rabbi Klavin writes 5 pages of Talmudic arguments to come to the conclusion, and we'll discuss this in the next class or the class after, of why we could assume that her husband passed away. But this was in 1912 when the Titanic sunk, and he was asked, and this was still when he was in Europe. In his time in Burlington, he wrote quite a few responses in Burlington itself. Also, he will discuss in the next class, he shared a story of 2 young teenagers that were arrested by the border, and how he worked very hard to free them and collect money for them. Rabbi Meskin was a very famous rabbi. He used to send his books out to all the other rabbis. He has a very interesting style of writing, and a very interesting style, as we'll discuss. So he was the rabbi in Chaye Adam until 1935. Now, in the mid-30s, with all the hardship of money, etc., the synagogues, each of the synagogues, Avos Gerim merged into Ovei Tzedek, and eventually in the late 30s, Chaye Adam merged back to Ovei Tzedek, and eventually they became only one synagogue. Rabbi Greenstein was the rabbi here for 2 years. And after him was Rabbi David Herman until 1945. And I think after him, I don't have a picture of him, was I think Rabbi Nachum Rabinowitz was a rabbi here from 1945 to 1950. As Mr. Samuelson writes in his book, Rabbi Nachum Rabinowitz had a very, very hard time here. The community was shifting already. They hired Rabbi Wall 2 years later or around that time, and Rabbi Nachum Rabinowitz was Orthodox, and there was a lot of conflict within the community of how the community should be, and he was a little bit stuck in between. These are roughly the rabbis of Burlington until Rabbi Wall. Now we're going to discuss Rabbi Rosenberg's life. Rabbi Rosenberg was a out of this world person. He was a rabbi here for 2 years, and I'm still not sure why he took the pulpit here. He was a great visionary, and he was a great organizer, and he thought way beyond his times of how to organize and how to fix things. He was part of a body called the Agudas Harabonim. The Agudas Harabonim is pretty much obsolete today, but then it was really the organization for Orthodox rabbis. Agudas Harabonim was the organization. Rabbi Israel Rosenberg was one of the leaders of this organization, and he took this organization to great heights and really envisioned what this organization could do for the Orthodox communities in America. As we'll soon see. Rabbi Israel Rosenberg was born in Lamza, and he was ordained by the Aruch HaShulchan, Rabbi Yechiel Epstein. Now, the Aruch HaShulchan is a very, very famous rabbi, Lithuanian rabbi. He has a book, Aruch HaShulchan. Those that are familiar, the book of Jewish law that is most studied today is called the Shulchan Aruch, which means a set table. The reason why it's called a set table is because all the laws are put in its right place, and when you open it up, it starts off the laws of when you wake up, the laws of when you pray, the laws of when Shabbos, etc., etc. It really took Jewish law and organized it into a body of work. Until then, Jewish law was really not organized in a specific work besides the Rambam, but that's for another time. So Rabbi Yosef Kaira wrote the Shulchan Aruch. Rabbi Yechiel Epstein wrote a book called the Aruch HaShulchan, the opposite of the Shulchan Aruch. That's what he called his works. In his works, he goes through every single law brought down in the book of Jewish law with its reasoning. It's a very interesting book to read. The book of Jewish law by Rabbi Yosef Kairo does not have any reasoning, just has dry laws. The Aruch HaShulchan, Rabbi Yechiel Epstein, was a great, great Torah scholar, and he wrote down all the laws with its reasonings. He also did something that no other rabbi did since Maimonides. He gathered all the laws that will become in effect when Mashiach comes. Maimonides wrote a book of Jewish law which really covers every aspect of Jewish life, even when Mashiach will come and we'll be back in the land of Israel and we'll have the temple in Eretz Yisrael in the land of Israel. The Maimonides covers every single law pertaining to that. The code of Jewish law, the Shulchan Aruch, only covers laws that are prevalent in exile today that we need to do, none of the laws that are pertaining to the land of Israel. The Aruch HaShulchan wrote a book, the Shulchan Aruch HaShulchan HaAsid, the set table that will be eventually, and he wrote every single law that will be in the times of the temple, when tithing, etc., etc. He was a great, great rabbi. That's what I'm trying to bring out. And he ordained Rabbi Israel Rosenberg, which means that he held very strongly of Rabbi Israel Rosenberg, and he wrote that if Rabbi Israel Rosenberg continues to learn, he'll be one of the greatest people that the Jewish people have these days. He gave a very strong endorsement to Rabbi Israel Rosenberg. Eventually, Rabbi Israel Rosenberg married he became the son-in-law of a very rich person. And eventually, the rich person lost his money, and therefore Rabbi Israel Rosenberg was left to fend for himself. And eventually, he decided to come to America to try to make a living. Rabbi Israel Rosenberg had a very interesting theory, And he seems like he was ahead of his time in that. In general, rabbis in America were a bit schleppers, meaning they didn't get paid well, and they didn't get paid well, and it was hard for them to live, etc. Rabbi Israel Rosenberg himself arranged a very good salary for himself, and we'll soon see how he pushed that other rabbis and other teachers should get paid very well as well. He first became rabbi in Poughkeepsie, New York. He became a rabbi, and then he became a rabbi in New Jersey, and then he joined the Agudas HaRabbanim, the place of the Organization of Orthodox Rabbis, and then he came to Burlington in 1909. What's interesting to note that when Rabbi Rosenberg came, there was an article in the Free Press about him. You could see in the book of Mr. Samuelson, there was an article in the Free Press about him, and it seems like it was like one of the greatest events that happened to the Jewish world in Burlington was that a rabbi's coming. And they went to, and the Burlington, the Free Press writes who picked them up, how they picked them up, how the synagogue was set up. Exactly, there was the flags that were there, and the great joy that was that there's a rabbi coming to town. Rabbi Rosenberg was known for his great sermons, and plenty of people used to come listen to them. Here we have recorded from the Free Press, I found this in the book, a speech from Rabbi Rosenberg. Just a few things that are interesting about his speech. He writes, it says he thanked the people for Burlington enthusiasm which they displayed by receiving him. He also declared, it's interesting, that he would be unlike the private soldier who in most cases concealed any misdeed of his captain, since the captain wears a more decorative uniform, and disclosing the just might result in the loss of life to the privates, but he would rather die on the battlefield irrespective of his family, revealing truth and honesty. And he continues through many a pulpit, he said, in many creeds is corrupted through the influence of wealth. But as his famous record shows, he would regard poverty and wealth alike. Then he continued to say like this. He proved that a preacher must practice what he preaches in order to become the ideal righteous man. He said that President Lincoln could never have gained such wide fame had he not been the real ideal person that he was. He would have never stood for the theory of emancipation if he alone would have had slaves in his homestead. He further brought out this idea in the words of God to Moses in Exodus chapter 21, and these are the laws of justice which thou shalt set before if you buy a Hebrew servant, etc. Evidently, God should have used the plural and said, if they buy a Hebrew servant, meaning God speaking to Moses, and God said, if any of the Jewish people buy a slave, this is what you shall do. But that's not the words of the Torah. The Torah uses the words, ki sikna eved ivri, when you acquire a Hebrew slave. Why is God talking to Moses when you acquire a Hebrew slave? Why when you acquire a Hebrew slave? It should be when they acquire a Hebrew slave, because God means all of the Jewish people are part of these laws. He says, but the Lord emphasized that the fact that Moses himself must set the right example before the Hebrews, and that he should carry out the laws as he preached them. So he got up, his first sermon was how he's going to be different, and he's going to embody what he preaches and disregard fame and wealth and treat everyone equally. That was one of his speeches. He was known to be a very, very prolific orator, and a lot of his speeches are printed in Hapardis, which is a pamphlet that used to come out for quite a lot of years. And Rabbi Rosenberg usually got the keynote speech by the convention of rabbis when he became in charge of the convention of rabbis, and everyone awaited him to speak. Fine. I am going to share with you some interesting insights of how the Burlington rabbis got paid. First of all, he was paid $18 a week. This is in 1909. $18 a week was roughly, I think it was quite a lot of money back then. How did they fund it? As we said, he wasn't the rabbi of a synagogue. He was the rabbi of Burlington. So the way he made money was, the way they paid for him was like this. A tax, it was through a 2-cent per pound tax on kosher meat. In order to buy kosher meat, a tax coupon had to be obtained from the secretary of the Chevra Kadisha to be present to the butcher at the time of the meat purchase. Meaning, when you went to the butcher and you wanted to buy a pound of meat, you had to produce a document from the Chevra Kadisha, from the Holy Society, that you gave 2 cents and you got a coupon. If you wanted to buy 5 pounds of meat, you had to have 5 coupons. I just want to make mention, the word Chevra Kadisha, the way it's used today, is the Chevra Kadisha means the burial society. But in truth is, the Chevra Kadisha back then was the society of holy people. It was basically how they used to run the community part of the Chevra Kadisha, meaning the people that ran the community were all part of this Chevra Kadisha. It's very interesting, in the Pinkas of Burlington, you see a fascinating way how to become part of the Chevra Kadisha. You had to swear, you had to give a promise, a pledge, that you will, and it's a whole official pledge that you had to write up, and you had to come to certain things, and you had to fast. There's actually anyone that has to do with burial. Until today, there's a fast day. It's the 15th of the day of Kislev. The 15th of the day of Kislev is the shortest day of the year, and it's customary, anyone that had to do with a deceased body, fast on that day to atone for if they treated the body unkindly, and part of this swearing in is that you have to come to the meal, etc., etc. So that's how they supported the rabbi, was a 2% tax on kosher meat. But as soon as Rabbi Rosenberg came, as I said before, he was a great visionary, as we're soon going to see. The first thing he did when he came to Burlington was, as it's noted, on his arrival to Burlington, he recognized the Hebrew school facilities were not okay. Immediately urged the community to erect a new and more modern structure for Hebrew school. He came and he saw that the state of Jewish education in Burlington was not up to par. Jews were here already for 20 years, the community was here already for 20 years, but nonetheless, the Hebrew school facility, and to my understanding also the attendance, was not up to par, and he right away decided that he's going to build a new building. It was agreed that the Hebrew school should be free school to assure all children of the Jewish faith a religious education, regardless of their ability to pay. It was as his assistants of Rabbi Rosenberg and Joseph Frank that girls were encouraged to attend the Hebrew school as well as boys. We know that in years that in the last century, Jewish girls did not usually receive a Jewish education, especially if you go back in history. The idea that girls go to Jewish school and learn Jewish texts is fairly new. We know the Beis Yaakov schools was one of the first schools to open up. Her name eludes me this second. There was a very famous woman that actually pushed to build the school for Jewish girls, and a lot of rabbis agreed with her. Meaning, it's not that the rabbis made the school; she made a school and got the rabbis to agree with her And those are the schools of Beis Yaakov today. When you walk in Borough Park or Williamsburg or anywhere in Brooklyn, and probably any place in Sarah Schneer, thank you. Yeah, she started the Beis Yaakovs, but when Rabbi Rosenberg came, I guess the only boys went to school, not the girls, and he changed that. Building a new school was a big ordeal. I think it costed $8,000 for buying the property back then, and I think Mr. Samuelson writes that their slogan on their paper was "Finish the mortgage by 1918." That didn't happen. In 1954, in 1952, they sold their building, which still had some money on it. But that was really what Rabbi Rosenberg's vision of Burlington was. He really cared about the Jewish education, and the first thing was he established that. What's interesting to note, I found when it comes to building this building, it's an interesting story that they sold bricks, just like at Chabad we sold bricks. We'll have plaques of anyone who pledged a brick, 1 brick, 2 bricks, 3 bricks for the building. They also, for this new Hebrew school on North Willard Street, they sold bricks. The bricks was a sum of $15. What happened was someone came and did not find his name on a brick. And that caused a big ruckus. And that caused a big ruckus. He complained. Eventually, they made peace, and they gave him back $750, and they kept $750, and they did not have to put his name on the brick. As we could see, we live in the same world. But what's interesting to note about this page is like this: the operation of the Hebrew school was a continuous struggle, in as much as it did not displace the various cheders as had been contemplated. What I think this means is basically that before Rabbi Rosenberg came, different groups had a teacher that taught their children, and there could be a cheder. A cheder was where Jewish children came and learned maybe after school. This person got together with a few neighbors and hired a teacher. The other person got a few neighbors together and hired a teacher. And it was called a cheder. It wasn't an official school. It seems like even though Rabbi Rosenberg made a Hebrew school that everyone should come to after school, I think it was roughly for 2 hours after school every single day. But nonetheless, certain people felt maybe that it's not a good education, or maybe they liked smaller classes, or maybe they had a great rabbi that taught their kids to learn the Mishnah and Talmud, etc., and they did not join that school together. And therefore, the Hebrew school was a continuous struggle. Rabbi Rosenberg, when he left, this is why he left Burlington. This is one of the eulogies. It says that because he was part of this Agudas Harabanim, this place of where, because he was part of this organization, when he came to Burlington, he did not feel that his full potential is being realized. Burlington was quite a small place compared to other places, and he already was a part of this establishment of rabbis, and his mind was elsewhere. And therefore, when he came to Burlington, as we see, he right away tried to build it up, but eventually he did not stay here, and he left. And he left almost every pulpit that he had, for it was too small of a place for him to really realize his potential. In his lifetime, he established 2 very important organizations. One organization was the Central Relief. After World War I, he established the Central Relief. It was an organization that helped Jewish people move out of Europe or to support ones. We know that it was very, very, very hard times then, and he started an organization that sent money there. Eventually, this organization came together with the Joint and really helped plenty of people. I don't know if we could say of anyone that was in Europe in the 30s and 40s and 50s that did not enjoy some relief from the Joint. Myself included, my grandparents all got money through organizations from the Joint to be able to move, to be able to live somewhere else, to be able to study. They even printed the Talmud, etc. Any type of food, anything was all money from the Joint. And Rabbi Rosenberg started the Central Relief, which eventually became a way that the Joint partnered with them to give them money and to be able to help many people. In one of his eulogies, a rabbi said, it's impossible to fathom what Jewish life would be today without the Central Relief from Rabbi Rosenberg. Another organization that he established was Ezras Torah. Ezras Torah was an organization to help rabbis have money. Rabbi Rosenberg strongly held that rabbis should be paid a good salary and should not walk around with shmates and should be able to be respectable. We see how Rabbi Rosenberg himself dressed. He dressed quite well. He collected a lot of money and sent money to Europe and to this to specifically help Torah students be able to live a normal life and eventually come to America as well. Those are two things that Rabbi Rosenberg was very, very famous for. And you see those things in the eulogies that were made on him. They really explain the great, that Jewish life would be different without him. And that's how big he was and how influential he was. And what's interesting to note that you don't have a record of his time here in Burlington that much, but Burlington, this first rabbi, had such a great person with a great vision within him. An interesting thing about him was that he was a peacemaker. In one of his eulogies, someone writes like this: Rabbi Rosenberg had a charm about him that he got together in one table a Hungarian rabbi, a Polish rabbi, a Russian rabbi, a Hasidic Rebbe, a Lithuanian Rosh Yeshiva, a Zionist, and he got them somehow to be part of the same organization. Something that I don't think happened since. And in his eulogies, you see how they really speak about the unity that he created. He had a way with people that he could really get together different types of people that have very different philosophies. A Hungarian rabbi to sit together with the Mizrahi, with the Zionist, and with the Hasidic Rebbe, all together in one table was quite a scene. And he had this power. He was a person with a great mind and a person with a great heart. And he knew how to speak to people and how to create that unity. And that's why his organization, Agudas HaRabbanim, was so successful, because he could collect everyone to be under one roof. Now I want to go to an essay that Rabbi Rosenberg wrote about American Jewry. We discussed a little bit about his personality, but here we go about what he thought about American Jewry, and he was quite sharp, let's just say. In this essay. This essay was printed in 1926. So just 15 years roughly after he left Burlington. In general, he wrote very richly and he spoke very richly. There's plenty of things that are printed. On his 70th birthday, they even made a book in his honor called Eidus LiYisrael. It's a book just in his honor. I'm not sure how many rabbis got that back then, but it just shows how influential he was and how respected he was within the Jewish community and to where he was. In his essay, he starts like this. He writes, in his essay he writes, plenty of people have this question, did American Jewry succeed? Did we make it yet? Did we establish ourselves enough yet? It's been years since we came from the 1804, even earlier, but the Jewish community started, and in 1920, seemingly, he says, people think we're settled. We got it. We already have schools, we already have yeshivas, we have everything we need already. But he says, if you look carefully, you see it's very far from it. And
talking about Rabbi Rosenberg.
And we'll just...
Then? No, but he was a rabbi for a short time. He was very involved. He started
this speech is a critique on everyone. Equal opportunity. Everyone gets critiqued. Rabbis get critiqued. Schools get critiqued. Parents get critiqued. Everyone needs to improve themselves. And he starts like this. And he starts like this. And truly, had there been important and worthy leaders, the crown of leadership would have not been extinguished. Their eyes would perceive the near and distant future, and they would act vigorously. Much could have been done in capacity to strengthen religion and Judaism. And through their influence, traditional Judaism would have been strong and respected. But he says that didn't happen. He says, if there was a visionary, American Jewish life would have been different. But that's not the case. He says the early immigrants became residents in America, and they basically assimilated. Many of them have amassed great wealth. Their children no longer listen to them. They've gone to college, they know secular studies, but the Torah knowledge is fragmented. Foreign ideologies have taken root, and the foreign language and terminologies have become prevalent. Their Torah and language the Torah's language is unfamiliar to them. The Father's influence wanes, and the impact of their teaching diminishes. He says that, and he says like this, that it used to be, and it's a long essay, it used to be that parents did everything for their children to succeed and to study Torah, and parents supported their kids, etc., etc. He says in America it's different. Your kid turns a certain age, you send your kid to go to work to make money. And that's all. And instead of worrying, he says, about the soul of the child, everything in America is only to make $1. And he continues, he says, but the root cause that led to the decline of Torah and Judaism here is a pursuit of wealth and riches. Money is the foundation of life here. Nowhere else in the world will you find people chasing after gold as they do in this land, the land of dollars. Even the children of Israel who came to this land have become ensnared in this pursuit, following others and beginning to focus all their desires, thoughts, and aspirations on one thing: to make money. And he says, for the sake of money, we have sold everything precious and holy to us. The Sabbath, holy festivals, and he writes, we have become soul murderers. Our children in this land have become victims because we did not make an effort to educate them properly according to the ways of the Torah. We compelled young children aged 12 or 14 to work in factories and various businesses to help us get rich. And he says an interesting idea on a passage in the Torah. The Torah says like this: each woman shall, and this is when the Jewish people left Egypt, each woman shall borrow from her neighbor and the lodger in her house objects of silver and gold. It says that every man and every woman, it's a little bit cut off over here, should borrow from the Egyptians silver, gold, and clothing. And it says, and you shall put these on your sons and your daughters, thus stripping the Egyptians. So Rabbi Rosenberg said like this: the Torah says you should borrow from your neighbor house objects, silver, gold, and clothing. What should you do with the money? Amass wealth? No. And you shall put these on your sons and daughters. you shall support your sons and daughters, send them to have a good Jewish education. Let them become familiar with the words of the Torah, with the language of the Torah, and not have to go work from age 12 or 14 and thus not know the language of the Torah. And he's critiquing, he knew, yes, children go to Hebrew school, and then it was even 2 hours every day, but he felt that it was not good enough of education for people to become familiar with Jewish life and with the Torah and with studying. That's one critique he has. Another critique he has, and you could tell me, he says, fine, the parents are no good, they need to fix themselves. What about the yeshivas? What about the schools, the yeshivas where people study Torah? He says something interesting. He says, ordination became such a party. When someone becomes ordained as a rabbi, it's called Chag Smicha. It's a party of the school that everyone's becoming ordained. He says, instead of, like it used to be in Europe, someone goes to school, to yeshiva, and they study Torah, not to become a rabbi. They study Torah for the sake of Torah. And eventually, when you know enough, you become a rabbi. Here, no, you learn to become a rabbi. That's why you went to school. You go to school to become a rabbi. You go to school, rabbi school. You don't go to study Torah. And he says, therefore, what are the rabbis going to know? If the whole purpose of going to school is only to become a rabbi, what are you going to know? You're not going to know any Torah. You're only going to know how to be a rabbi. And therefore, he says, your knowledge is going to be quite nothing. And he says, imagine the knowledge of your community will be close to nothing because you have nothing to teach them. And he says the real way is that we should send our children to school, to yeshiva. And in yeshiva they should study Torah and focus on those things and not focus on becoming a rabbi. And then he says his final piece. His final piece in this essay from 1926. And those that are familiar with Jewish politics will find the next thing I'm going to read quite fascinating. He says like this, my dear ones, we now have to gather together, united as one, the Mizrahi, the Aguda, the Zionist. And you have to have vision to try to get these three groups at a table. Until today, those that are familiar with Israeli politics, there's a party of Aguda, there's a party of Mizrahi, and they are two separate tracks. He wanted them to be united as one. With the united front, we stand together. Together we strive with dedication and holiness, following the teachings of our Hebrew tradition. For only if we are united and guide our sons and daughters appropriately, will the state of Judaism be saved from a severe and terrible danger. And therefore he says like this. This is the final point of his essay. We shall create a special fund for education. And if there's sufficient money, then perhaps we can establish yeshivas in every corner of the land. We should create a special fund specifically for Jewish education. And we should create a yeshiva, a school of higher Jewish learning in every corner of the land. In small cities that can't have a yeshiva, let's establish classes in Judaism. And he says like this is, let's encourage and impress on the parents that young children need to learn the Hebrew language to the point where they can understand our Torah. And let's establish that no parent shall spend less than $10 a week on educating his children. This is in 1926. $10 a week roughly was, I think, quite a lot of money back then. And a parent should not, if I'm not mistaken, in Hebrew school, the tuition maybe was 50 cents in Burlington in 1909. 50 cents, 25 cents a week. But he says no less than $10 should a parent spend on educating his children. And he says, let's pay our teachers well so that talented teachers see it as a career. He felt that, it was easy not to pay the teachers, not to pay the rabbi, and then who's going to want to become a rabbi, who's going to want to become a teacher. So he created this mindset that teachers and rabbis need to be paid quite well in order for them to sustain themselves. And other people should want to join and become teachers as well. And that is actually something that the Jewish community is struggling today. If you listen to podcasts of Jewish life in Brooklyn, one of the major themes is how badly we pay our teachers and how they have to take other jobs, etc. Who wants to become a teacher today, etc. So we could say one of the things that Rabbi Rosenberg has done in his life was Jewish education. That's one of the strongest things that he pushed for, was that, and we see that really resembles when he came to Burlington. That's part of his story. The first thing he did was establish a free Hebrew school just for that, building Jewish education. He felt that, and as we said, he was a Talmudic scholar of a different caliber. His stuff are printed in Hapardis and quite a few works. He printed his things. They're very high level scholarship, and he hoped that can stay, and the children that grow up in America will be able to have that type of education as well. So this is just a picture of one of the first rabbi in Burlington. We're going to cover in the next few classes a lot of the other rabbis and their interesting lives, but here's just interesting. Burlington had the merit to have Rabbi Rosenberg here, which was a great leader and a very, very famous leader in the Jewish community, part of Agudas HaRabbanim, and part of helping Holocaust survivors, helping Torah scholars, and establishing and worrying about the state of education in the Jewish world at large. And Burlington had the merit to have him, and you see stuff that he did later on. He started and tried to solidify doing just that in Burlington. He was known to be a very kind and refined person, and they say he had a heart of gold and a very, very great head, a very great mind, and he really embodied plenty of great attributes. When he passed away, it was very sad for the Jewish community. He was eulogized by many great rabbis. One of the rabbis saying that we've lost the one that could put everything together. We have rabbis here, but we're missing Rabbi Rosenberg, someone that could really put together and bring together everyone and have a united front. He passed away in 1956, and he's buried in, if I remember correctly, in New Jersey. So this is the end of class number 1, which we discussed Rabbi Rosenberg. I just want to put up his picture again. I was interesting to note that he looks very different than all the other rabbis here. All the other rabbis have full beards. At least most of them have full beards. And Rabbi Rosenberg did not have a full beard, which was quite interesting back then. He was very religious, very devout. He came from Lithuania, where they used to trim their beards. But it's interesting to note, and it's a style how Brooklyn people speak maybe, but one of the people that gave a eulogy said that even though he looked very different than other rabbis, he looked more modern, nonetheless, you couldn't tell that he didn't have a beard. Because of his whole personality, it wasn't a thing. People didn't see that, which was, as I said, was quite rare back then. Yeah, so this will be the end of the first class of the history of Burlington rabbis. I hope in the next few weeks to talk about many of the other rabbis. I might jump to Rabbi Clavin next week. Rabbi Clavin was the second rabbi of only OZ. Rabbi Klavin, as far as I understand, his picture still hangs there today. A great Torah scholar, and I'll try to bring out their life, their scholarship, and their contribution to Burlington Jewry and Vermont Jewry and Jewry at large throughout their lifetime. And I hope to continue with Rabbi Klavin. Then there's Rabbi Meskin, and there's a lot less that can be found on the other rabbis, but I'm sure with more research we will be able to do that. What struck me as an end note is that usually a great rabbi has a Wikipedia page. Unfortunately, many of the rabbis of Burlington do not have one. Whoever wants to try to make that happen, that would be great. Rabbi Rosenberg, for example, does not have a Wikipedia page. It's quite hard to find information about him. It's really tucked in to different books that were written about him, or not written about him, but eulogies that were written that are really tucked away in different journals that were published in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So good evening, everyone. It's good to see everyone. And anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to ask.
Thank you.
And we'll continue, God willing, next Thursday. Next Thursday with the next Rabbi of Burlington. Any questions, comments? Some information I got wrong. Or maybe those only come in emails.
Hi, it's Susanna Levin.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thank God. This is really interesting. I was looking at the map of Burlington. There's this building on Winooski Avenue. It's the Legal Aid Society now, the Vermont Legal Aid. And I remember that there's a plaque on the wall there, on the outside wall, that says that it's the Hebrew Free School.
Yeah, so it's that. I mentioned the wrong street.
Oh, okay. I was wondering if that was a different one. Okay.
No, that was actually one. What's interesting to note is it was very sad when the communities again split. Even though there were 3 synagogues, but for a time they were all in peace. Then eventually when Rabbi Tzedek hired Rabbi Sachs, that created a whole split. And eventually each group wanted to build their own Hebrew school. And that created a big strain, a financial strain on the communities. It wasn't that big. There are a lot of Jews, but it wasn't that big. So Rabbi Tzedek wanted to do one, and Chai Adam wanted to do one. And we know the market crashed in 1929. And that really fight did not end well, did not do anything good for anyone. It just put a very, very hard strain on the Jewish community, building their own Hebrew school instead of joining together as was in years past. Eventually people worked very hard, and in the mid-30s and late 30s the synagogues combined together, and that put everything at peace. But there was what's interesting to note is that in the book, Sir Samuelson writes that even though the synagogues was very contentious in the 20s, the 2 rabbis, as we'll discuss, were friends with each other. They actually both learned in Kovna, in Slobodka, which is next to Kovna. There's 2 schools in Slobodka. I'll discuss this more at length next week. One was part of the Musar movement. I'll explain that next week. One was not part of the Musar movement. And Rabbi Klavin and Rabbi Meskin both studied, one in one yeshiva, one in the other yeshiva. And they were quite friends. They used to take walks on Shabbos and discuss Torah, discuss Talmud together. And someone heard from them or something. They didn't really understand why the community is fighting. They didn't really grasp what this fight was about. They were the rabbis, but seemingly they didn't have too much control over the congregation. So I messed up a few dates. Ozi Synagogue, Rabbi Tzedek, was founded in 1885. The Chevra Kadisha was founded in 1886. Chai Adam was founded in 1889. So that's like 13 years after Rabbi Tzedek was founded. And the merger was in 1939. I think Avas Gerin merged in 1935, I think, and Chaya Adam merged in 1939. That was, Chaya Adam was next to Ohavei Tzedek, down the block where the mural was. That was the synagogue of Chaya Adam. It is unfortunate that those that did do a lot of research and history about Burlington, they're very little, as I said in the beginning, about the rabbis. And I always wondered how much influence the rabbis had on the congregation. The congregation was established without a rabbi. There wasn't a rabbi for many years. So it's just interesting what the connection was and how closely they worked together or they were understood, etc. But there's still and as I said before, next week we'll discuss from the writings of Rabbi Klavin and then Rabbi Meskin. Within there, with Rabbi Klavin's writing, you see how the burial practices change. Until today they changed, and Rabbi Klavin agreed to change them based on some reasoning, and you see a bit of a shift of the observance of the community in the 1930s. You see the first divorce was in 1930, the burial practices changed in 1930. Even though in the book, Mr. Salmon says in 1900 was the first divorce that was documented in the secular courts, but based on what Rabbi Klavin says, the first Jewish divorce was only in 1930. There was another divorce that happened, which is a complicated divorce, which is not a real divorce, which happened under Rabbi Sachs. But we'll discuss that next week based on the Responsa of Rabbi Klavin. I think someone just corrected me. As I think I mentioned this, the Hebrew Free School was founded in 1910 by all three synagogues, and they all chipped in. And Ohavei Tzedek gave, I think, $3,000, and the other synagogues each gave less than $1,000, as recorded in the book from Mr. Samuelson. So we'll continue next week with more anecdotes and more information and what we could glean from the rabbis about life in Burlington, to be continued.